due to have Cameron Wood speaking at this point. He hasn't yet arrived. Professor Selassie has very kindly agreed to swap places with him, so that if Cameron does appear later on, we can fit him into the program. Professor Selassie, as we've said before, attended the conference in 1958 as a delegate from Ethiopia. He's a leading scholar in African law, history and politics, and professor of African and Afro-American studies at the University of North Carolina. He's been actively involved in political reform in Eritrea, and was principal author of Eritrea's constitution. So it's a wonderful opportunity to hear from him here today. Following him, we'll hear from Professor Dan Branch, who's Professor of African History at the University of Warwick, and a specialist on the post-war history of Kenya, one of the leading scholars in the UK in that field. We will then have a senior research fellow from the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, Marika Sherwood, hugely respected, very well known for her prolific work on Pan Africanism, the African diaspora, and slavery, and someone who's helped so many young scholars get started in this field. So wonderful to hear from Marika. And finally, Susan Williams, who, as I said, helped to set this conference up. Another extremely prolific writer whose work has focused extensively on Africa, post-war Africa. Her book on the death of Dag Hammarskjöld, her book on the Soweto and Ruth Kama affair, which was turned into a wonderful motion picture recently. And most recently, Spies in the Congo, Race for the All That Built the Atom Bomb. So I've got to kind of try and re-establish my reputation as a tough chair after allowing the previous session to run over slightly. So I am going to insist that people speak for no more than 15 minutes, and I am going to kind of then summon courage to be assertive. Say so. All right? See if I can manage that. Professor Selassie, if you'd like to start.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. Thank you very much. Greetings, brothers and sisters. Or as Kwame Nkrumah used to say, brothers and sisters, and freedom fighters, which was one way of arousing the assembly. I must be one of probably the only one here today, right now, who survived the AAPC conference of 1958. I am blessed with a long age, with a moderately good health. At 86, I was a young 26-year-old graduate when the AAPC conference took place, eager to meet an idol, an African idol, Kwame Nkrumah, who, when I was a student here at the University College in London, came to give us a rousing speech on the need for Africans to unite. We were all impressed by his eloquence, by his passion, and that really enrolled me on my long journey toward Pan-Africanism. Cameron Wood and I belong to the hardy and hearty generation of Africans who had a kind of romance with Africa at the time, a special kind of romance. a continent that was just emerging from a dark history of European colonization with a great deal of promise. We must remember, I'm not going to repeat the master representation of Chikanyoku. The context of the All-African People's Conference of 1958 is important, I think, to remember. First of all, there is the context of a world emerging from the most devastating war of 1945. With that war also came the opportunity for Africans to claim their God-given freedom and independence. Ghana's independence was not really the first in Africa. There were 3 or 4 African countries. There are African countries, Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt, of course, and Sudan. Sudan became independent a year earlier, in 1956. But not only because of the fact that Ghana is part of the sub-Saharan Africa, or Afrique Noire, as the French call it, Black Africa, but also because of the personality of Nkrumah and the passion he infused among Africans, both young graduates like myself and the then emerging leaders, statesmen of Africa. I think it's very important, I'm not a psychologist, to remember that personality, leadership counts a lot in starting and leading movements. I don't think there would be the kind of Pan Africanism that affects my life and the life of many other young Africans without Nkrumah. And without the all-African, Pan-African spirit that he did not invent. The word itself was coined by a great African-American scholar, statesman. Does anybody remember the name of that scholar? Du Bois. Du Bois, the Americans call him, but Du Bois. Since I speak French, it should be Du Bois. But let's defer to our American way of calling him Du Bois. A great man, a great scholar. The first African-American at that time called Negro to study history and sociology at Harvard University. He had also studied in Germany, so he spoke German, understood German perfectly. He was a scholar and also an activist. He used the method of analysis as a weapon of struggle. And he tried to impress upon his younger followers the importance of study, of scholarship, as a weapon of struggle. And that spirit, I think, got on and has been an important factor in the struggle for human rights, for independence, and for democracy. The second context I would like to note, by the way, I don't know whether this was Susan or somebody found in the research, something I must have said, which they quote as what I call the at once defining and awe-inspiring moment of the December 1958 conference. Susan, are you here? Was it you who found that? I am thrilled and really happy to see that kind of quote. Scholars like to be quoted in our crisis of relevance. Being quoted is a very important weapon to continue. Now, I'm going to use that as a kind of context to continue my remarks. What do I mean by a defining moment? In what sense was the December 1958 conference that Nkrumah convened, defining. It was defining to us young Africans at the time because the idea of Pan Africanism, unity among Africans, in the context of the emerging liberating African liberation, in terms of thinking as Africans, thinking of unity as a very important weapon of struggle. Because remember, at that time, there were only 8 or 9 independent African countries. All the rest were under European colonial rule. The sense in which that moment was also defining and or inspiring was that Nkrumah dared to challenge us, dared to challenge Africans to think in terms of unity, continental unity, and also to think in terms of taking ourselves as weapons of the struggle ahead of liberating the rest of Africa. So he spoke of African unity and African liberation and African unity. It was not for the first time that I heard that notion of the importance of unity to liberate Africa. I heard it first when he came to University College London and gave out that wonderful speech. And he spoke as African, continentally. I have been blessed by having also studied French, so therefore I used to meet Africans, Francophone Africans in Paris, who saw themselves as French citizens. I remember they asking me, vous êtes anglais ou français? Are you French or English? And I would say, ni l'un, ni l'autre, neither one or the other. What do you mean? I'm not English, I'm not French, I'm African. And there was a very important union of African students, which is called Fraternal, Fédération des étudiants africains en France, led by the current president of Guinea, Alfred, who was a couple of years younger than me. But looking at his pictures now, I look 10 years younger than him. It's a function of the fact that when you are in politics, you age, Sweden. That's probably why I have avoided political appointments. At the time when I attended the 1958 conference, I was a simple cipher, a lawyer in the Ministry of Justice, just beginning my career. As a lawyer, I spoke and thought in terms of values, not power, but the values of freedom, the values of independence, the values of social justice. And that attitude sustained me all my life. An African-American student in my class a few years ago, who heard about my career. I had been Emperor Haile Selassie's Attorney General, would you believe it? And when that was told to this man, he came and said, Professor, you are Attorney General of Emperor Haile Selassie. So how come you are now a mere teacher? A mere teacher? First of all, he asked me, oh, by the way, you speak quaint English. Where are you from? Well, I'm from Africa, obviously, but I don't speak with quaint accent. You speak quaint accent. I speak quaint English. And when he asked me, what am I doing as a mere teacher, I told him, being a mere teacher is probably the noblest of professions. I have done things, I've been there, I've done that, but I feel fulfilled as a teacher, preparing minds for the future. I define myself as a teacher, not although I have known power, such as it was. The importance of study, of research, advocated by the great Du Bois, has been a part of my life. Because of that, I really avoided politics. I had a chance to go on and on as minister in the Alfred's government. But then there was a clash of values between me and His Majesty. May his soul rest in peace. He, of course, as emperor, as head of government, he thought primarily in terms of power. And I repeat, I thought primarily in terms of values. I saw myself in quite a quandary. As Attorney General of a man who was king, who held the lives of his citizens, of his subjects in his hand. On the whole, a good man. He's also a good man, actually world famous. But then, as a leader of a nation, he had to think in terms of power, which means control. Now, my education in Britain, in the liberal arts and in law, meant that my values were defined by that study. And therefore, I was in quite a dilemma as His Majesty's subject, and yet I wanted to transform Ethiopia's legal system, liberalizing it, making it more amenable for freedom of thought, of movement, and so on. And that was not really possible for me. Then, of course, there's the fact that I come from a place called Eritrea, which at the time of my birth was under the Italian rule. So I was born Italian, believe it or not. Italian subject, but Italian nevertheless. And then I became a British protected person when the British occupied Eritrea after the World War II. And then I became Ethiopian by virtue of the fact that I was in Ethiopia when Eritrea was joined to Ethiopia by the United Nations. 3 different nationalities in a lifetime. That creates quite a problem for any person, for a bigger shoulder to carry 3 nationalities. And then I became Eritrean by choice. When I resigned from His Majesty's government over many issues of law and rights and so on, but also because of his policy on towards Eritrea. He sought to absorb Eritrea into his empire, even though the UN-arranged federation gave Eritrea an autonomy, regional autonomy, and therefore we clashed there. We clashed. One day he called me and said, "What do you think? What would you think if we abolish the federation, the imperial we?" And I said, "Your Majesty, if you do that, then it would be like arousing the sleeping lions. The words in Amharic are actually more powerful." And he looked at me with his penetrating eyes, and if eyes could kill, I would have dropped dead there and then. But I survived, so he didn't say anything, just dismissed it with the wave of the hand. I left, and expected to be the midnight knock at my door for about a week. But for some reason I was spared. I resigned, left Ethiopia in 1964, following just after the Cairo conference, the second OAU conference, which accepted the colonially fixed boundaries as defining the nation statehood of Africa. It was an exciting moment for me, also fearful. I left Ethiopia suddenly and found a place in the United States, a job, and brought my family to America. And years later, I became an American citizen. So that's 4 nationalities in a lifetime. I think the record, the Guinness record. Well, I'll just conclude by saying that Nkrumah's idea of Pan Africanism is still alive, ailing a bit, still alive. When I gave the Nyerere address in 2011 in Dar es Salaam. There's a book called Reimagining Pan Africanism, which I think Susan got.
It's there.
In which I give an account of the development of Pan Africanism and the possibilities of Pan Africanism. I mentioned a resolution passed by the African Union, under which the good leaders of Africa thought that they can advance integration by reliance on the common African core values. Very important. And I discussed the 5 aspects of the core values in that meeting. If you have a chance to read this book, they're detailed there. So my speech there, my address, addressed the development of Pan-Africanism and its consolidation and the creation of the OAU. I was one of the members of the drafting committee of the charter, ex officio member as Attorney General of Ethiopia. And Nkrumah nearly walked out of that conference because he did not get what he wanted, complete unity of Africa. And I saw African culture, diplomacy at work there, in which Emperor Haile Selassie persuaded Sekou Touré to go and please bring back your brother. We cannot have Africa fail because a great man walked out. And I remember the Emperor said, Je vous prie, mon fils, allez et amenez-le. Please, I will beg you, my son, go and bring him. And I remember Sekou Touré saying, you know, Sekou Touré was very tall, and the Emperor was very short. Sekou Touré bowed down and said, we pay. Yes, father. He went and brought him. And Nkrumah ended the conference by giving a rousing speech, almost poetic. I'll end there.
Thank you very much.
I think every historian always has a sense of trepidation when sharing a panel with someone who lived through the events they're going to discuss. So, that's a sense of nervousness that I think early modern historians never have to let's also say thanks to the organisers, Susan and Mandy particularly, for the invitation to be part of such an illustrious event. I think it's a great credit to the audience and the panellists that they have brought together here. I'm going to speak about Tom Mboya, the chair of the AAPC. I was in Stanford last week, fortunately, looking through his papers as part of a longer term project I'm part of, and I came across correspondence he had with his editor at Brown Little, who eventually published the book, title you can see here, Freedom and After. And when Mboya first put the prospectus together for the book in 1959, he started with an account of the AAPC, which, as you can see, described as the proudest day of his life, the opening of that conference. His editor response was, I think this is somewhat dull. People will forget about the conference very, very soon, and therefore there's no real reason to start with that particular event. Mboya showed a level of astuteness that was typical of him and stuck it in and kept it there, and for very good reason, as we can see today. The AAPC was an event of great significance to him and he to it. He was one of the stars of the show. His famous closing remarks directed towards the colonial powers, scrammed from Africa, are obviously referenced here in the title of my paper. And his full words there were, whereas 72 years ago the scramble for Africa started, from Accra we announced that these same powers must be told in a clear, firm and definite voice, scram from Africa. His opening address, that came at the end, his opening address was no less well received by the conference delegates. He, in the words of the New York Times, threw away his prepared text and made a speech during which one could have heard a pin drop in the pauses between bursts of cheering and clapping. He boldly proclaimed the need for rapid independence across the continent, and indeed, we've already heard much about Nkrumah. Mboya's speeches, if anything, were even more determined in their sense of the need for urgent independence, for rapid unification, and he indeed led a subcommittee of the conference in its deliberations on the formation of the United States of Africa. So far, all very straightforward. In Freedom and After, in his biography by David Goldsworthy, the AAPC appears as almost a ritual celebration, a symbolic celebration of the triumph, or the imminent triumph of African nationalism. But I think we have to be a little bit careful not to resort to hagiography as we look back with the benefit of historical records and hindsight. The story of Mboya, the AAPC and Pan Africanism, or at least Mboya's version of it, were more complicated than that sort of sounding of the trumpets may imply. Building on a much wider body of scholarship than just mine and my own research over the past few years, I want to try and make two different arguments about the importance of Accra to Mboya and vice versa in the time available here. The first is the connection between domestic and global politics. Pan-Africanism did not exist in the ether. It was a matter of substance to the domestic politics of the various parties involved. Too often accounts of conferences like the AAPC, I think, lose sight of this, and their actors become unanchored from the constituencies that they represented in Accra, and which helped shape their understanding of Pan-Africanism and its relevance to day-to-day politics. The second broader point I want to make is about the central importance of trade unions to both this domestic and international story. There's a remarkable, I think, stream of recent historical literature that's emerging on this theme that I'm very much deliberately building on here. And what this work, and I hope my paper here, demonstrate is the very complex connections between different historical processes at work in the 1950s and which all came out to play in Accra. Decolonisation, the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, development and global debates about justice and equality. And I think the important point to stress here is all of these concepts were deeply contested. And I think Mboya brings this to the surface. So, any presentation, I think the previous speaker here has made the point about youth, I think, in his own account of his own presence there. And I think that's one of the defining characteristics of this generation. It's quite staggering, I think, to sit back and think about how these young men and women made this world. Mboya was 28 at the time of the Accra conference, and he was a few weeks short of his 39th birthday when he was assassinated in 1969. He had emerged in Kenyan politics as a trade union leader in the mid-1950s in the most unimaginable circumstances, really, where any political figure in Kenya, that was including his own father-in-law, that voiced any sort of dissent was all too quickly wrapped up with a label of Mau Mau sympathiser, arrested or restricted in some way. Mboya was a remarkably talented politician who was able to negotiate the climate of the 1950s in Kenya to make genuine contributions and improvements to the lives of Africans in Kenya during that period of time. Once in office as Secretary General of the Kenyan Federation of Labour, he first extended already existing connections between the KFL and the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, the umbrella body for what essentially became a sort of anti-communist trade union international movement based in Brussels. And this helped him to a degree, particularly in work with the British TUC, to help get trade union activists in Nairobi freed from detention in the most egregious cases of abuse of power in the law by the British colonial regime. But he became very quickly frustrated with the TUC in the UK because of its essentially sort of pro-British stance in most of these discussions. During his time in the UK at Ruskin in Oxford, he then that connected him into the US. really. And he visited the United States in 1956, and his prior connections with the ICFTU in Brussels connected him then to the American Federation of Labour and Congress of Industrial Organisations, which merged into what became known as the AFL, or is still known as the AFL-CIO. And that's a very important part of the story that I'll come back to in a moment. So before I get into the details of that relationship between Mboya and US trade union organisations, I think it's important to emphasise his importance to the cause of African nationalism in Kenya and more generally. At a time in which it was astonishingly difficult for any coverage of Kenya to make any mention of anything other than Mau Mau, Mboya did more than any other individual to shift attention away from British propaganda depictions of violence in central Kenya to discussions of constitutionalism, of change, of reform, and I think for all of what I'm going to say later, he's a figure that deserves immense credit and praise for that role. His election as one of the first African members of the Legislative Council in Kenya in '57 brought in further international attention, particularly once he and his fellow elected members put pressure on the government to end the emergency, accelerate constitutional reforms, and release Kenyatta. All three aims were achieved in 6 incredible years. So I want to say something very briefly. The emphasis of what I'm going to say is much more on the second point I was making about global politics, on the domestic politics. And what you can see here on the slide is a picture outside KANU headquarters in 1963, and Mboya on the right of the picture, hugging Jomo Kenyatta in the middle, and Mwai Kibaki, who became president between 2002 and before Uhuru Kenyatta took office. And really what I want to emphasise here is the way in which the Pan Africanism that Mboya espoused at Accra, I think in common with many of the other delegates, was something that was grounded in a sort of a grassroots cosmopolitanism. The literature on the 1950s, or post-war politics, I think, in many African countries, has become increasingly fixated over the past quarter century in really on trying to narrate a history of the emergence of ethnicity, or what might be called tribalism. We're trying to find the historic roots of this process. And I think for all of the value of that scholarship, what's been missed is actually a history of a different type of political imagination. A history very much grounded in cosmopolitan urban spaces, which was not least out of necessity, but also echoing back to, in many cases, 19th century pre-colonial political organisation, a history of cooperation, a history of interdependence, and a history of a sort of liberal progressive agenda that isn't perhaps best captured by the emphasis on ethnicity in a lot of the current literature, particularly in Kenya. So the quote there I've pulled up is one of, I could have used hundreds of comments from letters from ordinary Kenyans to their political leaders in this period, particularly to Mboya, who represented time and time again in Nairobi politics a determined cosmopolitan, non-ethnic, Pan-African stance, which again and again, whether in KANU, the ruling party, the Kenya African National Union, founded in 1960, in its internal elections or in competition with other parties, consistently won popular support in to an overwhelming extent. And it's that body of opinion that Mboya was representing in Accra. His Pan-Africanism was not something that existed in abstract terms. It was about the city in which he lived and the city that he represented politically. It was about Goans, it was about Indians, it was about that sort of spirit. The other point I want to make here, though, is the way in which this then connected up with other strands of politics at Accra. The big figure here you can see is Maida Springer, who was a key figure in the AFL-CIO in the States, but became a key trade union figure in East Africa, spent a lot of time both in Tanzania and Kenya, shaping the local trade union organisation. And her quote there is an account of the conference back to Jay Lovestone, who was the AFL-CIO's sort of key foreign policy man back in the United States. Springer, Irving Brown, who was with her there, George Hauser, these were key figures in trade union politics, but also in civil rights politics in the United States. And their agenda there was about encouraging not just African nationalism in an effort to try and prevent what they saw as the conditions for the emergence of communist sympathies among African populations frustrated by colonial rule. That was part of the story, but also about encouraging the growth of the connections between the civil rights movement in the US and the trade unions, particularly in the southern states. So, lurking behind the AFL-CIO, though, was CIA money. And the CIA used the AFL-CIO as a way of accessing African nationalists and funding them, no figure more so than Mboya. And that's the part of the story I think we have to try and address, that we can have simultaneously a figure like Mboya as both a hero of the Pan Africanist movement, but also one that increasingly over the 1960s found that his connections to the US, which were no secret at the time, were well publicised. He indeed used to put this on his posters in Nairobi, backed by American money. This was not a sort of hidden story of covert support. This was seen as a virtue in the late 1950s, but as the progress of international politics moved on in the 1960s, obviously Vietnam, obviously the frustrations of the civil rights movements in the United States, that became increasingly out of kilter with the mainstream of that sort of Pan-Africanist thinking, and left him isolated from his once allies, particularly with the Ghanaians. He had a very, very close relationship initially with the Ghanaian TDC, but he found himself increasingly isolated from them. Now, I won't say too much. I want to sort of skip on just quickly to really to go back to Accra and thinking about significance for Mboya, and I'll wrap up at that point. Accra gave Mboya a tremendous international exposure, an unquestioned leader of the Pan-African movement at that time. His correspondence that I've seen flooded in from across the world, from the basically oppressed peoples of every single corner of the world, from Papua New Guinea through to Latin America. He was seen as this incredibly symbolic importance. But he also proved his worth to the American trade unions. For all of the sort of grand, eloquent speeches at Accra, behind the scenes there were other sessions taking place as well as the plenaries. One of the most important was a discussion of the trade union affiliation between African trade unions with these international groups like the ICFTU. And the ICFTU with Springer, particularly in Brown, were anxious to prevent independent African trade unions disaffiliating themselves from these international bodies and therefore escaping influence. The ICFTU and their American counterparts were greatly concerned about neutralism. This idea that if African independent trade unions were separated off from their influence, they would then become susceptible to influence from the Soviets and the Chinese. And so one of the great things from the perspective of the AFL-CIO and the ICFTU that took place at Accra was a behind-the-scenes session of trade union representatives, where the trade unions that were there agreed to remain temporarily, it turned out, within the confines of the ICFTU, and therefore remaining connected to them. And Mboya was very grateful for this. This was also the way his money was flowing into his campaigns back in Kenya. So when he left Accra, he left both as an international Pan-Africanist, but also a figure held in the highest repute by his American backers. He had done, along with his colleagues in the Ghanaian TUC, he'd done more than anyone else to convince their fellow African trade unionists to stay within the ICFTU. And that then launched him onto the global stage, particularly in 1959 with a tour to the US, where really his emergence as this global international figure was complete. And I won't say much more than that. I'll leave it there given the time constraints. But there's a whole story that then follows after that, which I'll skip over. So thank you very much.
So, Marika.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I must say I only had 3 nationalities, not 4, and I'm actually 5 years younger than you. And what I'm wearing is Hungarian, and those of you who know it, this is Ghanaian. I don't have Ghanaian nationality, but I go there once a year and have for the past 20 years or so. What I I'm questioning is whether there could have been an All-African People's Conference without George Padmore. Those of you who know nothing about him, he was born in Trinidad, worked for newspapers there before emigrating to America, where he was writing even more, working with all the people involved in the struggles against racial discrimination, and joined the Communist Party there and ended up in Moscow. In Moscow he continued writing now for all the newspapers published in Moscow and elsewhere, and was appointed editor of the Negro Worker, which was a very important newspaper at that time, and was read pretty well around the world. Padmore managed to smuggle it into many countries by going to talk to seamen in Hamburg and giving it to them and giving them the money to buy the postage stamps when they docked. Because of course the colonial masters did not want anything from Moscow, never mind the Negro Worker. It was an enormous threat. So Padmore was very active in America, in Trinidad, then in Moscow, then in Hamburg, where he's still editing the Negro Worker. And then he decides to quit the Communist Party, long story, ends up in London. And London is a hothouse of activity by many African and Caribbean groups already, and local black peoples. And with C.L.R. James and Amy Ashwood Garvey, and it's very important, I think, to note that there is a black woman involved in these struggles from the 1930s onwards. They form an organization regarding the Italian proposal to invade Ethiopia. They lose, of course, because most Westerners support Italy. They then form another organization which again publishes newspapers. The newspaper changes its name every 4 months or so, and I think this is because the colonial masters, of course, would not have wanted any newspaper published by George Padmore to be entering either a French or an English-speaking colony. So they kept changing the name. Then in 1945, when there was a meeting of trade unionists, Padmore invited them to a discussion on whether there should be a Pan African conference, and I think this is very important to note, that that is part of the foundations of the 1945 Pan African Conference. Kwame Nkrumah arrives from America shortly after this conference was held, with an introduction to Padmore. Now, Nkrumah himself had been very active in America while a student. He had also written for journals, was one of the people who formed an African Students Association, and had a lot of practice speaking around America on the need for African unity and independence. So this is Kwame Nkrumah in America in the early 1940s. So then he arrives in England with an introduction to George Padmore, and they begin working together, not surprisingly, given their backgrounds, on the organization required for this Pan-African conference. And Nkrumah, in his autobiography, talks about this, and talks about Padmore and how they sat in his flat and talked with each other and worked on organizing the conference. What in one way is very important here is to note what two of the biographers of Padmore have to say about Padmore's contacts at this time. Leslie James says that as the editor of all these journals, he received copious correspondence, and by the end of 1932, he could boast a vast network of individuals and organizations across Africa, the United States, West Indies, Britain, and to a lesser extent Latin America. Hooker, James's, Padmore's earlier biographer, says that his network expanded to about 4,000 people around the world. So this is what Nkrumah is confronted with, is being introduced to all of these people who have been in touch with Padmore about Pan Africanism, about independence, and I think to a somewhat lesser extent African unity, but I don't know that anybody has analysed Padmore's writings to see how much he talks about unity. About independence, yes; about unity, I don't know. So anyway, they hold a Pan-African conference, and Nkrumah is much involved with that. And through Padmore and other organisations, he travels around England talking with people and talking to them about the need for unity and independence. And I think it's very, very important to the development of Nkrumah as an international person, that through Padmore he meets so many people in England and is introduced to so many others by mail. Nkrumah, of course, then goes home, and in 1951, but the papers aren't very clear, he invites Padmore to go to the Gold Coast to investigate what is going on there. And one person reports it as he was invited to witness Nkrumah's installation as a leader of government business, whereas one of the biographers says this is what Padmore actually did while he was there in 1951. He covered the aftermath of the colonists' first elections for international newspapers and helped organize a number of key administrative units for Nkrumah's party. He helped organize the CPP headquarters, the editorial office of the Accra Evening News, and even the news department in the news section of the Department of Foreign Affairs. He created a study syllabus for the department's members and drafted an outline of diplomatic procedure for them. The local papers certainly noted that Padmore was traveling around the country, giving talks, especially to young members of the CPP. And just to quote you from one report, Padmore thrilled Accra audiences at the Royal Cinemas with a powerful historical speech about Africans and colonial struggles. There were 3,000 people attending, which shows you the influence, I think, of Padmore. If there were 3,000 there, how many thousands listened to him traveling around the country? Padmore then comes back to England and writes a book called The Gold Coast Revolution, which is published in 1953. What we learned from the released MI5 files on Nkrumah, which end in 1953, and some of the papers have been removed, and on the pages released there are lines and paragraphs blanked out. And what the MI5 files very seldom tell you is what is done about the information collected. But it's very clear from that Padmore and Nkrumah's correspondence is intercepted and photographed. They would have suspected that this might happen, especially after Nkrumah's office in London was clearly raided, which is not in the MI5 files, so it might have been MI5 or the Metropolitan Police, whose papers have not been released. So they used other people's addresses and gave each other different names. But MI5 was collecting all these from an informant usually referred to as Swift, and in other papers referred to as Chest. Now, how many informants there were, we don't know. How they became informers, whether they were paid We just don't know at the moment at all. But clearly a lot of research, if possible, needs to be done. Anyway, what then happens is there's the Conference of Independent African States, right? And what Nkrumah does is he sends Ako Ajay and Kofi Bako to London to talk with the ambassadors of these independent states and to talk with Padmore. And Padmore goes to visit the ambassadors with Kofi Bako and Ako Ajay, and then goes with them to visit these cities. So why were Kofi Bako and Ako Ajay so involved with Padmore? Is it that Padmore had much more experience than they had? And they needed somebody with experience of speaking internationally. And here was Padmore. He had a lot of that experience. What then becomes important in regard to Padmore's position here is that Professor St. Clair Drake, who became Professor of Sociology at the University in Accra, reports that on their return to Accra, it became Padmore's job to help work out a program of non-violent positive action and tactical action on a continent-wide scale. The conference was arranged under Padmore's personal guidance. And Padmore himself noted that the arrangements were in his hands. And the journal Pan Africa reported that Padmore was very prominent behind the scenes. So Padmore is also very much part of this Conference of Independent African States. So we move on from that to the All-African People's Conference. And of course, I don't know who did the inviting and how it was decided whom to invite. But I think these thousands of people that Padmore had correspondence with through his years as an editor, as a journalist, and as an activist, would have been absolutely crucial. And also that he had discussed the holding of the Pan African Conference with trade unionists. So he would have had links to the newly developed trade unions in many parts of Africa. So to me, again, I think Padmore and his contacts would have been absolutely crucial to who is invited to attend this conference. And I will sort of leave it there, except to say that, of course, Padmore stays in Accra and continues working with Nkrumah and traveling with Nkrumah. Almost every time Nkrumah goes somewhere within Africa, Padmore is there with him. So it seems to me that Nkrumah is dependent on Padmore. It is very clear from the intercepted files that they discussed absolutely everything, which then makes you wonder about independence. And, you know, if you're discussing, as they were, for example, the new constitution that Nkrumah wants to introduce, and that is read by MI5 and therefore passed on to the Home Office and the Foreign Office, who then pass it on to the American State Department, then anything that they are planning can be prevented, because these people already know. I will stop there with a very sad note, I think, on African independence, and a plea to recognize the importance of George Padmore, all right, behind the scenes. But I think he was absolutely crucial to the struggle for independence within Ghana, and to some extent the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Countries from all over the world outside Africa were represented at the AAPC, and many were sending reports back home. One of these, not surprisingly, was the UK, On the one hand, the Governor-General, Lord Listowel, beamed benevolence throughout the conference and invited delegates to a party at State House, where he and his wife both wore kente cloths. But meanwhile, behind the scenes, a flurry of ciphered telexes reported on daily activities at the conference, sent to London and to the administrations of British-ruled African territories. And not long after the conference, the Colonial Office wrote to the Foreign Office, "As you know, we regard the AAPC and many of its leading members as objectionable and capable of causing considerable harm in our African territories. For this reason, we would prefer the intel to be rather more firm in its appraisal and to make it clear that the conference must continue to be regarded as dangerous from our point of view." In the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, Prime Minister Roy Welensky described the AAPC as the climax of a conspiracy against civilized standards, and his Federal Intelligence and Security Bureau, the FISB, sent spies to the conference, quite a few, whose detailed reports contributed, in fact, to the imprisonment soon after of Kenneth Kaunda. This is worth remembering when we listen to Dr. Kaunda's message to us after lunch. Other countries were also sending reports home from Accra: France, Portugal, South Africa, the People's Republic of China. The second political secretary at the Israeli embassy in Accra, who had an intelligence brief, sent information home. There were many journalists from the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, some, mysteriously, without an affiliation. This was pretty standard stuff in the world of surveillance at that time, and could to some extent be prepared for. "We were trying to be very careful," said one organiser, "because you didn't know who was who and which government had sent in spies." And the structure of the conference was used to protect delegates. A last-minute decision by the steering committee ruled that only full delegates from African trade unions and African political groups were allowed to participate in committee meetings. This meant that attendance by fraternal delegates and observers, who were mostly from outside the continent of Africa, was limited to the plenary proceedings in the mornings. But it was less easy to prepare against the American Foreign Intelligence Agency, the CIA. For the CIA was not simply snooping and surveilling, but infiltrating on a fairly intensive scale, secretly creating and developing contacts with delegates from African countries who didn't know the CIA was behind these efforts, attempting influence over them and over potential policy, inserting roots into African politics generally, and providing disinformation. And this is what I am going to look at briefly in this paper. American interest in Africa was growing rapidly at that time. In 1958, Eisenhower established the Africa Bureau at the State Department. And although in 1958 African operations at the CIA were shared with the Near East, a dedicated Africa division was set up in 1959. And if you look at the excellent 1958 map of Africa in your pack, you'll see that it comes from the CIA map library. And no wonder the CIA wanted to infiltrate this extraordinary conference, attended by, if you like, a who's who of African nationalism. But the US was playing a careful game. Although high-level greetings to the AAPC came from the Soviet Union, China, East Germany, North Korea, North Vietnam, and many more countries, there was nothing from the US until the very end. It was assumed that the US was anxious to avoid alienating its NATO allies. This disappointed many African delegates. For the most part, Americans were seen as allies in the struggle against colonialism. The fact that the US had sided with Egypt against France and Britain in the Suez Crisis of 1956, just 2 years before, seemed to burnish its reputation as a champion of freedom in Africa. The many American organizations that were represented at the AAPC, and individual Americans, were welcomed. Well, I need to give just a little bit of background here. In 1958, the CIA was just 11 years old and was widely respected in the US. But less than 10 years later, in the mid-60s, the New York Times and the magazine Ramparts revealed that a huge number of American organizations were actually false fronts, secretly financed by the CIA. This triggered horror, a congressional and press firestorm which swept across the country. And it emerged that more than 225 different institutions were direct or indirect recipients of CIA funds. These included the National Student Association, charitable foundations, and university research projects. The CIA financed films in Hollywood, such as George Orwell's tale, Animal Farm. Hundreds of millions of dollars were involved. The organisations were funded through an array of pass-through conduits, including well-known foundations like the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller and Carnegie. As well, a range of false front conduits were used, dummy organisations such as the Farfield Foundation. And two of these CIA fronts were directly represented at the AAPC, the African American Institute and the American Society of African Culture. The African American Institute, known as the AAI, had been established in 1953 by a collective of individuals, including Dr. Horace Mann Bond, a leading educator who was then president of Lincoln University, Nkrumah's alma mater in the US. Bond came to the AAPC having asked Nkrumah for invitations for himself and others. The AAI helped to sponsor and support African students in their pursuit of higher education in the US and maintained a headquarters in Washington called the Africa House. It also published a journal called Africa Special Report. Alan Dulles, the CIA director, had recruited prominent businessmen to the AAI board, including the heads of companies with big shares in the mines of the Belgian Congo and Rhodesia. The AAI became effectively a mouthpiece of the US government and corporate interests in Africa. Participants in the various exchange programs were white and included extreme Afrikaner nationalists from newspapers like Die Burger. In 1957, an office for the AAI was set up in Accra, and at the AAPC in 1958, the AAI held a reception for conference delegates. Bob Keith, a journalist for the AAI journal, Africa Special Report, was registered as an American press correspondent at the AAPC, and in a dramatic moment, Keith was found hiding in the Accra Community Centre during a closed session of the conference, which was off limits to the press and fraternal observers. He was arrested by Ghanaian police, who discovered recording equipment on his person. Kanyama Chume, a delegate from Nyasaland, remembered this later. Spies had been planted by the imperialists, he said. One of them was found at the bottom of the rostrum on which the leaders of the delegations were sitting. The AAI was used by the CIA as one of its conduits to pay Holden Roberto of Angola, the leader of the Union of the Peoples of Angola. Roberto was at the AAPC under the pseudonym of Rui Ventura. George Padmore was deeply suspicious of Roberto, who made contacts around the fringes of the conference under yet another pseudonym, Jose Gilmore. Roberto was given increasingly large and regular sums by the CIA. Many people here will be aware of the instrumental role of Roberto and the CIA in the sufferings of the people of Angola. Roberto worked closely through the 1960s with an American political scientist, John Markham, based at Colgate University, who was a regular writer of articles for Africa Special Report. And John Markham was also at the AAPC. He'd gone to the Ivory Coast on a Ford Foundation grant and came to Ghana for the conference. And Markham served as Patrice Lumumba's informal interpreter. Many years after the AAPC, Nkrumah learned that the man who had served Lumumba as an informal interpreter was a CIA agent. Neither he nor Lumumba had suspected this at the time. As Lumumba did not speak English, he had accepted the offer gratefully. The Congolese diplomat, Thomas Kanza, observed many years later that the interpreter facilitated a friendly introduction between Lumumba and the Americans. Even at the meeting between Lumumba and Nkrumah, said Kanza, the American was translating, and also at the meeting with the Soviets. There he appeared to be French, because they were speaking in French, and for him to be accepted as an interpreter, he couldn't say he was an American. In Kanza's judgment, Lumumba may have told the interpreter more than was advisable. In private meetings with people from Western and Eastern countries alike, explains Kanza, Lumumba vented his anti-colonialist and anti-Belgian feelings in a way he had never been able to express to his Belgian friends. Another CIA front represented at the AAPC was AMSAC, the American Society of African Culture, which had been established in 1957. Its professed aim was to expose African Americans to their African heritage and was explicitly anti-communist, albeit avowedly apolitical. The CIA regarded AMSAC as a foil to the Council on African Affairs, which gave a powerful voice to Pan Africanism and left-wing politics through Paul Robeson, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Alpheus Hunton Jr. AMSAC published African Forum and had an ambitious cultural programme. This included a music festival in Lagos in 1961, where stars like Nina Simone performed. AMSAC had offices on East 40th Street in New York, an apartment on Fifth Avenue to host guests, offices in Paris. It gave scholarships to African students, including Barack Obama's Kenyan father. AMSAC threw so much money around that it developed the image of Uncle Moneybags. AMSAC sent three key delegates to the AAPC. One of these was its president, Dr. Horace Mann Bond, who, you may recall, had co-founded the AAI. Another delegate was Mercer Cook, a professor of French who was living in Paris. And the third was John Davis, a political scientist in New York. According to one historian, AMSAC's executive council were in on the secret, and so were the officers. Far from being dupes of the CIA, he concludes, they were among the agency's most effective secret agents. John Davis of AMSAC sent detailed reports to the US on the speakers and events at the AAPC with very careful analysis. The busy activities of some Americans at the AAPC were noticed by other delegates, including the Communist Party of the UK. A report by the CP noted, it's been nauseating to observe some of these Americans grouping together in secret caucuses in the hall of the Ambassador Hotel to plan their strategy and tactics, or to notice their shining broad grins suddenly revert back to their original poker faces after they finished their work of winning friends among African personalities. They were also, as you've seen in the case of Roberto, making important contacts for the future. At the AAPC, Mercer Cook of AMSAC established a relationship with Ezekiel Mphahlele, a well-known writer from South Africa. Cook was also involved with the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was founded in 1950 and based in Paris. It may be the best known of the cultural fronts set up and funded by the CIA. It was active in 35 countries, and I could tell you a lot more, but I'm sure I'm running out of time, so I think I'll cut this down. It was remarkable, its presence all over the world, and it had a journal entitled Encounter. And the Congress for Cultural Freedom ran a vast Africa programme, of which Mercer Cook became director in 1960. A couple of years later, he went to Senegal as US ambassador, so he then arranged for the position to be given to Mphahlele, with whom he had made a significant contact at the AAPC. Mphahlele went on to be involved in a huge range of activities in Africa on behalf of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which were funded by the CIA. When the CIA funding of the Congress for Cultural Freedom was exposed in the 1960s, Mphahlele was defensive. Sure, he said, the CIA stinks, but the fact that the funds were infiltrated did not mean that the activities were infiltrated. Some people claim he was witting, that he knew that he was CIA funded. Some claim he was not. One of the American delegates at the AAPC who was clearly witting was Irving Brown, a white trade unionist and member of the American Federation of Labour and Congress of Industrial Organizations, the AFL-CIO. At that time, it was, as Dan has said, obsessed with eliminating communism, and its international arm was tethered to the CIA, and some people called it the AFL-CIA. Irving Brown was not a CIA agent as such, but the CIA helped him finance his major projects. He became involved early on in the Algerian War. He channeled CIA funds to the Algerian national movement in order to oppose the National Liberation Front, the FLN, which was fighting the French. Since the FLN sent a large delegation to the AAPC, including Frantz Fanon, these rival groups were both represented in one room. One can only imagine the tension felt by Brown when Fanon gave his speech at the conference and took the audience by storm. I'm going to cut the next bit because Dan has covered it very well. Those people at the AAPC who were funded wittingly by the CIA were there under false pretenses. And when Nkrumah spoke movingly of the United States of Africa, they were focused, on the other hand, on the needs of the United States of America. And just briefly to say, I know I've got to cut this. At that time, the CIA was doing appalling things, funding MKUltra, a covert program in which the mental states of unwitting participants were manipulated, aggressive interventions in a foreign country, such as the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran in '53 and the coup in Guatemala in '54. In terms of Africa, we know that CIA activities involved secret funds, poisons, assassinations, and disinformation. Not long after the AAPC, the CIA drew up plans to kill Patrice Lumumba, who was assassinated just over 2 years later. The CIA betrayed Mandela to the apartheid South African government in 1962, and so the list goes on. These activities were not exposed until the mid-1970s, chiefly by the Church Committee, but many in the civil rights movement were very suspicious at that time of the CIA. One of these was Islanda Robeson, the wife of Paul Robeson, a powerful activist in her own right, who suspected that disinformation was being very powerfully spread through the audience. Well, just coming to my last point, until 1958, Ghana was dependent on Britain for its intelligence services. Specifically, it was dependent on the Security Liaison Officer representing MI5. But Nkrumah was conscious of the need for Ghana to develop its own intelligence services. According to the historian Calder Walton, GCHQ both shared intelligence with Nkrumah's government and continued to spy on it. It offered Nkrumah one-time pads made in Britain on the grounds that they were difficult and costly to manufacture, but it also enabled Britain to read Ghanaian communications. And in 1958, the year of the AAPC, Nkrumah asked Prime Minister Nehru of India for help with setting up an intelligence organisation. This Nehru readily provided, and Ghana's first independent intelligence service was set up. Nkrumah was proved right in his judgment that Ghana needed an autonomous intelligence service. In September 1961, the agent in Accra of an American diamond dealer phoned his employer in the US on an open transatlantic phone line, giving details of a plot for a coup, including his assurances to the coup organisers of American support. But the line had been tapped by Ghanaian security agents. The American agent had compromised everyone involved, including the top CIA man in Accra. This was about 8 months after the assassination of Lumumba. September 1961 was the beginning of the end of Nkrumah's relationship with the US. Ezekiel Mphahlele spoke movingly about the AAPC afterwards. Inspired by Nkrumah, he said, "We heard the rumble of wheels of freedom's chariot just around the corner, but it seems that the wheels of America's chariot were also just around the corner and were driving headlong into the tide of decolonization rolling over the continent of Africa."